So a parishioner told me this story. He said that I fell asleep in church. Then I heard, "Stand up." So I stood up and people clapped. The pastor said, "Who else will give $2,000? So today, the church invites us to learn and appreciate the virtue of charity. Just as Christ offered himself totally for our salvation, we must not be afraid to give for the good of others. In the first reading, at a time of famine, Prophet Elijah, instead of helping the widow, who together with the stranger and the orphan are considered poor in the Old Testament, request help from her. The poor widow generously offers the prophet the last handful of flour in her jar and a little oil in her jug. Directed by love of her neighbor and not by fear, she is rewarded for her trouble, and the jar of meal was not spent, for the jug of oil emptied, till after the Lord sends the first rain. The responsorial psalm is a wonderful song of praise of God. The ancient Jewish people frequently sang these praises, exalting the God who cared for the powerless, the widow, and the orphan. The second reading highlights the fact that Christ offered himself a once and for all offering for our salvation. And in our gospel story, it's a story of the widow, ties up with the widow in the first reading. Both widows offer everything in faith, mindless of themselves and their needs. In doing so, they show their great love for God and their great trust in Him. So the gospel story of the widow is the culmination in a series of stories that Jesus shared to his disciples on their journey to Jerusalem. But today's story happens inside the temple in Jerusalem. While Jesus observes the people who enter the temple, he is touched by the generosity of the poor widow as she contributes to the maintenance of the temple and the upkeep of their priest. He calls his disciples to see what happens, but he starts by pointing at the scribes and the Pharisees and warns them not to follow their examples in seeking honor and attention from others. Jesus does not just hold the scribes up for ridicule. He wants us to see ourselves in the scribes and the Pharisees and perhaps make some necessary changes in our attitudes and behavior. The temptation to be like the scribes and Pharisees who strive for a righteousness which doesn't include compassion or care for those in need is ever present, but ultimately isn't really attractive. Jesus warns us that they devour the property of poor, defenseless widows and make cover as an excuse by looking good or appearing to be pious. But turning to the widow, Jesus upholds the poor widow's offering 2 small coins of little value for his disciples' consideration, commending her because her small offering was an act of profound generosity, giving from her livelihood rather than her surplus. Moreover, her offering was an act of trust in God that He would provide for her. This kind of trust in God allows the widows to move outside their fears and to really help someone in need. This is what Jesus is inviting us, especially we who have grown in faith and trust in God, to see and do. It is sometimes said that it is common for us who have plenty to give from our surplus. It is also said that those of us who are poor often give, even from what we need. Pope Francis, however, goes farther in teaching us that we should not only be willing to give, but also to receive from others. In his reflection on the rich young man who asked him what more he ought to do to inherit eternal life, the Pope tells us that it is not enough to simply give. We must also allow ourselves to receive. It is not enough to love Jesus. We must open ourselves to be loved by Jesus. So remember the widow in our first reading. God responded to her faithfulness and took care of her. Her jar of flour didn't go empty. Her jug of oil didn't run dry, and her water remained. God took care of her in a way that she could never have taken care of herself. So we make a big difference when disciples like you and me get properly attuned to God, acquire the mind and heart of God, and accept Jesus' invitation to be giving and to be humble to receive from others in return. We believe that God will provide for our needs.